Get away from my car, you filthy little rat. The sharp voice cut through the Manhattan morning air like a blade. Richard Mansfield's perfectly polished Italian leather shoes stepped aggressively toward the small figure crouched near his gleaming black Mercedes. The boy couldn't have been more than 12, his torn jacket barely protecting him from the October chill that swept through the financial district. His small hands clutched a piece of cardboard with crooked letters spelling, "Hungry, please help," while his hollow eyes looked up with a mixture of hope and fear. The contrast was stark and painful. The towering glass buildings reflecting the morning sun, the businessman in his $3,000 suit, and this child who seemed invisible to the rushing crowd. Richard's face twisted with disgust as he fumbled for his keys, his Rolex catching the light as he gestured dismissively at the boy. "You're making my car look cheap, kid. Move along before I call security." His voice carried the authority of someone who had never been told no, someone whose bank account had 7 figures and whose word moved markets. The child named Tommy slowly gathered his cardboard sign, his stomach growling audibly in the silence between them. He had been sitting there since dawn, hoping someone would spare even a quarter for breakfast, but the endless stream of suits and heels had passed him by like he was made of air. Now this man, this giant with his angry eyes and expensive cologne, was making him feel smaller than he already was. Have you ever witnessed a moment that reveals someone's true character? Tell me in the comments where you're watching from, because this story is about to take you on a journey you'll never forget. The financial district of Lower Manhattan was Richard's kingdom, and he ruled it with an iron fist wrapped in silk. At 42, he had built Mansfield Holdings from the ground up, turning a small inheritance into a real estate empire worth $200 million. His office on the 35th floor of the World Trade Center offered panoramic views of the city he was slowly buying, piece by piece. Every morning, he would stride through these same streets in his handmade suits, breathing in the scent of success and power that seemed to emanate from the very concrete beneath his feet. The homeless population that had grown in recent years was nothing more than an eyesore to him, a reminder of weakness and failure that had no place in his carefully orchestrated world. Tommy Martinez had been living on these streets for 8 months now, ever since his grandmother passed away and the state couldn't find any relatives willing to take him in. The foster system had failed him twice, and running away seemed safer than enduring another house where he was just a monthly check. He had learned to be invisible during the day and alert at night, finding warmth in subway grates and food in the kindness of strangers who were becoming increasingly rare. His grandmother used to tell him that every person had goodness inside them, but staring up at this angry businessman, Tommy was beginning to doubt those words. The man's eyes held nothing but contempt, as if Tommy's very existence was a personal insult to his perfectly ordered life. "I said move," Richard's voice rose, causing several pedestrians to glance over before quickly looking away. This was New York, after all, and getting involved was a luxury most couldn't afford. Richard reached into his jacket and pulled out his phone, his manicured finger hovering over the security number. "You have 10 seconds before I have you arrested for vagrancy and trespassing." His words carried the weight of someone who had used money and influence to make problems disappear before. He had donated to police charities and knew judges personally. A homeless child would be processed and forgotten by lunchtime. The threat hung in the air like storm clouds, heavy with the promise of consequences that would only hurt the powerless. Tommy stood slowly, his thin frame barely reaching Richard's chest, but something in his dark eyes flickered with a quiet dignity that seemed older than his years. "I'm sorry, sir. I didn't mean to bother you." His voice was soft but clear, carrying a slight accent that spoke of his Mexican heritage, and the grandmother who had raised him with values this man clearly couldn't comprehend. He began to walk away, his worn sneakers silent against the pavement, but as he passed Richard's car, he noticed something that made him stop. The businessman's briefcase sat on the hood, apparently forgotten in his rage, and papers were beginning to scatter in the autumn wind. Without thinking, Tommy began gathering the documents, his small hands working quickly to prevent them from blowing into traffic. Richard watched in stunned silence as the boy he had just threatened carefully collected the contracts and financial reports that contained sensitive information worth millions. Any one of those papers in the wrong hands could destroy deals he had spent months negotiating. Yet here was this child, this filthy rat, as he had called him, protecting Richard's interests without expecting anything in return. For a moment, Something flickered in Richard's chest. Was it gratitude? Recognition of humanity? But the feeling was quickly crushed under the weight of his prejudices and pride. He snatched the papers from Tommy's outstretched hand without a word of thanks, his jaw clenched tight with the effort of maintaining his superiority. "Don't think this changes anything," Richard muttered as he shoved the documents into his briefcase. "You're still not welcome here." But even as he spoke the words, something about the encounter felt different, unsettling. The boy had looked at him with eyes that seemed to see right through the expensive facade to something Richard preferred to keep hidden. Tommy nodded once, a gesture that somehow conveyed both understanding and forgiveness, before turning to walk away into the maze of concrete and glass that made up his uncertain world. Richard climbed into his Mercedes, the leather seats enveloping him in familiar comfort, but the image of those eyes, tired, hungry, but somehow still hopeful, remained burned into his memory. The day proceeded as usual for Richard, filled with board meetings, power lunches, and the intoxicating rush of closing deals worth more money than most people would see in a lifetime. His assistant, Margaret, had prepared his schedule with military precision. Breakfast at the plaza with Japanese investors, a meeting with city planners about a new development in Brooklyn, and an afternoon presentation to potential buyers for his latest luxury condominiums. Each interaction reinforced his belief that success was simply a matter of being stronger, smarter, and more ruthless than everyone else. The weak were meant to serve the strong, and sentiment was a luxury that cost too much in his world of profit margins and quarterly projections. Yet throughout the day, Richard found his thoughts drifting back to the morning encounter with an irritation he couldn't quite shake. The boy's face would appear at the most inconvenient moments, during a crucial negotiation about a Times Square property, while reviewing financial projections, even during his evening workout at his private gym. There was something about the child's quiet dignity that challenged everything Richard believed about poverty and worth. He had always assumed that homelessness was a choice, a result of laziness or moral failing, but the boy's careful handling of his documents suggested intelligence and character that didn't fit Richard's neat categories of success and failure. As Richard returned to his penthouse apartment that evening, the elevator rising smoothly toward the clouds, he tried to dismiss the day's strange mood as exhaustion from a particularly demanding schedule. His apartment occupied the entire top floor of a building he owned, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a view of the city that sparkled like scattered diamonds below. The furnishings were minimalist and expensive, everything chosen to project an image of refined success that had taken decades to perfect. He poured himself a glass of 30-year-old scotch and stood at the window, looking down at the streets where he knew people like Tommy were settling in for another night of uncertainty and cold. For just a moment, the distance between his warm, safe apartment and the harsh reality below felt like more than just physical elevation. The irony would not become apparent for several years, but fate was already setting the stage for a reversal that would shatter every assumption Richard Mansfield held about power, worth, and the arbitrary nature of fortune. The boy he had dismissed as worthless would prove to have a strength and intelligence that Richard's money could never buy, while the empire that Richard believed made him untouchable would prove to be built on foundations far more fragile than he could imagine. The streets of Manhattan had witnessed this encounter between a man who thought wealth made him superior and a child who possessed riches that couldn't be counted in dollars, and those same streets would soon become the setting for a transformation that neither could foresee. Meanwhile, 3 miles away in a doorway near Penn Station, Tommy Martinez pulled his thin jacket tighter against the evening chill and opened a book he had found in a dumpster behind the public library. The pages were water-damaged but still readable, and by the light of a street lamp he continued his self-education in mathematics and science, subjects that came to him as naturally as breathing. His grandmother had always said that knowledge was the one thing no one could take away from you, and even though she was gone, her words continued to guide him through each difficult day. He didn't yet know that this chance encounter with a cruel businessman would become the catalyst for a journey that would take him from these cold streets to heights that Richard Mansfield could never imagine. But somewhere deep in his heart, Tommy still believed that every person had goodness inside them, waiting for the right moment to emerge. The weeks that followed that encounter brought an unexpected emptiness that Richard couldn't quite name or dismiss. His usual routines felt mechanical, as if he were sleepwalking through a life that had once energized him completely. The morning ritual of selecting his tie, checking his appearance in the full-length mirror, and reviewing his appointments had become a performance without an audience that mattered. Even his victories felt hollow. Closing a $15 million deal in Midtown should have been cause for celebration, but instead left him staring at his reflection in his office window, wondering why success no longer carried the same intoxicating rush. The city below continued its relentless pace, but Richard felt strangely disconnected from the energy that had once made him feel invincible. Sleep became elusive, filled with dreams that confused and irritated him in equal measure. He would find himself back on that street corner, but in these nocturnal visions, the roles were somehow reversed. He was the one asking for help, while faces in expensive suits walked past without acknowledgement. The dreams always ended the same way, with those dark eyes, filled with a wisdom that seemed impossible for a child to possess, looking at him with something that wasn't quite forgiveness, but wasn't condemnation either. Richard would wake in his king-sized bed, silk sheets damp with perspiration, telling himself it was nothing more than stress from his expanding business empire. But the unease lingered throughout his days, casting shadows over achievements that should have brought satisfaction. The memory of his own childhood began surfacing with uncomfortable frequency, unbidden and unwelcome as tax bills in his pristine mental landscape. Richard had grown up in a modest two-bedroom house in Queens, the son of a factory worker father and a school secretary mother who had worked double shifts to afford his college education. Back then, they had known the anxiety of choosing between heating bills and groceries, the shame of wearing hand-me-down clothes, and the constant fear that one unexpected expense could topple their carefully balanced financial house of cards. His parents had sacrificed everything for his education, believing that knowledge and hard work could lift him out of the perpetual worry that had defined their lives. Their love had been demonstrated not through words or affection, but through the relentless pursuit of opportunities they had never been given. The transformation from that frightened, ambitious boy to the man he had become hadn't happened overnight, but through a series of compromises and calculations that had gradually hardened his heart like concrete setting in cold weather. His first job on Wall Street had taught him that kindness was perceived as weakness, that empathy was a luxury that cost deals and respect. He had watched colleagues who maintained their humanity get passed over for promotions, while those who treated people as numbers advanced rapidly up the corporate ladder. The lesson had been clear. In a world where money was the ultimate measure of worth, sentiment was not just useless but actively destructive to success. So Richard had buried the boy, who had once given his lunch money to a classmate whose parents couldn't afford school meals. The irony wasn't lost on him that his empire had been built partially on low-income housing developments, properties where families like the one he had come from struggled to make rent each month. But he had learned to see these tenants not as people with stories and struggles, but as revenue streams and statistics in his quarterly reports. When he raised rents or refused maintenance requests that would cut into profits, he told himself it was simply business, the natural order of capitalism, where the strong thrived and the weak adapted or perished. The distance between his penthouse and the apartments he owned wasn't just measured in floors, but in a moral elevation that allowed him to sleep peacefully while others worried about eviction notices. Yet something about that homeless boy had cracked the armor Richard had spent decades constructing around his conscience, letting in light that revealed uncomfortable truths about the man he had become. The child's willingness to help despite being treated with contempt challenged every justification Richard had created for his ruthless business practices. It suggested that goodness could exist without wealth, that dignity could survive circumstances that would crush most people, and that perhaps the qualities Richard had discarded as weaknesses were actually sources of strength he could no longer access. The possibility that he had spent his entire adult life moving in the wrong direction was too threatening to acknowledge directly, but it gnawed at him like a persistent toothache. Meanwhile, in the harsh reality of Manhattan's streets, Tommy was discovering that survival required resources he hadn't known he possessed when his grandmother was alive to protect him from the world's cruelest lessons. Helena Martinez had raised him after his parents died in a car accident when he was 3, filling their small apartment in Washington Heights with the warmth of unconditional love and the rich traditions of their Puerto Rican heritage. She had taught him to read in both English and Spanish before he started school, encouraging his natural curiosity about mathematics and science, while instilling values that now seemed almost naive in their optimism. Her stories about their ancestors who had overcome poverty and discrimination had painted a picture of a world where character mattered more than circumstances. The apartment they had shared had been tiny, but filled with the aromas of sofrito and the sounds of salsa music that had made Tommy feel rich in ways that had nothing to do with money. Helena had worked as a seamstress in a factory in the Bronx, her fingers growing stiff from years of repetitive motion, but she had never complained about the long hours or low wages that barely covered their basic needs. Instead, she had focused on Tommy's education, helping him with homework at their kitchen table while she mended clothes for neighbors to earn extra money. Her dream had been to see him graduate from college, to watch him achieve the opportunities that had been denied to her generation through circumstances beyond their control. The night Elena had her fatal heart attack, Tommy had held her hand in the emergency room while she whispered her final words. Recuerda, mijo, tu valor no viene de lo que tienes, sino de quién eres. Remember, my son, your worth doesn't come from what you have, but from who you are. She had made him promise to continue his education no matter what happened, to never let circumstances define his potential, and to always remember that kindness was never wasted even when it wasn't returned. Her death had left a hole in Tommy's world that seemed too large for a 12-year-old to bear, but her words continued to echo in his mind during the darkest moments of his life on the streets. The foster homes that followed had been temporary stops in a system overwhelmed by children who needed more than it could provide. The first family had been kind but distracted, treating Tommy like a houseguest rather than a son, while the second had been openly resentful of the monthly stipend that barely covered his basic needs. Neither had understood his grief or his intelligence, dismissing his questions about advanced mathematics as showing off and his emotional withdrawal as defiance. When the second family began discussing sending him to a group home, Tommy had made the decision that seemed logical at the time. He would take care of himself the way Elena had taught him, relying on his wits and the belief that good people still existed in the world. The streets had quickly taught him that survival required a different kind of intelligence than the academic knowledge that came so easily to him in school. He learned to read the subtle signs that indicated which doorways were safe for sleeping, which restaurant managers might offer leftover food, and which police officers would move him along without calling for backup. The public library became his sanctuary during the day, a place where he could continue learning while staying warm and clean, but the nights remained a constant struggle against cold, hunger, and the fear that shadowed every homeless child in a city that had learned to look away from their suffering. Books became his escape and his hope, transporting him to worlds where intelligence and perseverance were rewarded, where heroes overcame impossible odds through courage and determination rather than wealth and connections. He devoured everything from scientific journals to classic literature, his mind absorbing concepts that would have challenged students twice his age while his body grew thinner from irregular meals and restless sleep. The contrast between his intellectual growth and his physical circumstances created a kind of cognitive dissonance that might have broken a lesser spirit. But Tommy held onto his grandmother's words like a lifeline in a storm. The memory of Richard Mansfield's contemptuous dismissal had joined the collection of small cruelties that comprised Tommy's daily existence. But unlike the others, it carried a different weight because it had been so unnecessary and personal. The businessman's obvious wealth and power had made his cruelty seem like a choice rather than a necessity, a deliberate decision to inflict pain on someone who posed no threat and needed only the smallest gesture of human recognition. Yet even as the encounter stung, Tommy found himself wondering about the man behind the expensive suit, questioning what kind of experiences had hardened someone's heart so completely that they could treat a hungry child like garbage. The question that haunted both Richard and Tommy, though neither could articulate it clearly, was whether people were truly capable of change once their patterns were established and their defenses were in place. Richard's wealth insulated him from consequences, while Tommy's poverty exposed him to constant vulnerability. Yet both were trapped by circumstances that seemed immutable and definitions of worth that felt imposed from the outside. Neither could see how their paths would intersect again, or how the very qualities that divided them, Richard's ruthless ambition and Tommy's unwavering compassion, would become the tools of their mutual transformation in ways that would challenge everything they believed about justice, redemption, and the unpredictable nature of fate. 3 months after that fateful morning encounter, Dr. Sarah Chen was reorganizing the mathematics section of the New York Public Library when she noticed the same boy for the 5th consecutive day, hunched over advanced calculus textbooks that most high school students would find incomprehensible. His clothes were clean but worn, his hair neatly combed despite obvious signs that he had slept rough, and his intense focus on the mathematical equations suggested a level of comprehension that defied his apparent circumstances. As the head librarian and former MIT mathematics professor, Sarah had learned to recognize exceptional intelligence when she saw it, but she had never encountered it packaged in such heartbreaking circumstances. The boy's notebook was filled with elegant solutions to problems that she used to assign to her graduate students, solved with a precision and creativity that spoke of natural genius rather than formal training. When Sarah approached Tommy's table with the pretense of returning books to nearby shelves, she couldn't help but glance at his work and feel her breath catch in surprise. The mathematical proofs he was constructing were not only correct but demonstrated shortcuts and insights that reflected a mind capable of seeing patterns invisible to most people. "That's quite impressive work," she said gently, her voice carefully modulated to avoid startling him. Tommy looked up with the wariness of someone who had learned that adult attention often meant trouble, but Sarah's genuine smile and respectful tone seemed to reassure him slightly. "I'm Dr. Chen, and I used to teach mathematics at MIT before I came here. I couldn't help but notice that you're working on some very advanced concepts." Tommy's initial instinct was to gather his materials and disappear, but something in Dr. Chen's manner reminded him of his grandmother's patient encouragement when she would help him with homework at their kitchen table. "I'm sorry if I'm not supposed to be using these books," he said quietly, already reaching to close the textbook. But Sarah shook her head quickly, settling into the chair across from him with a warmth that seemed genuine rather than patronizing. "You absolutely should be using them. In fact, I'm fascinated by your approach to this proof. Would you mind explaining how you arrived at this particular solution?" The question was posed with the respect one colleague might show another, and Tommy found himself cautiously beginning to explain his reasoning, his voice growing stronger as he realized that Dr. Chen was genuinely interested in his mathematical insights rather than his personal circumstances. Over the following weeks, their informal tutoring sessions became the highlight of Tommy's days, providing not just intellectual stimulation, but the first meaningful human connection he had experienced since his grandmother's death. Dr. Chen never asked intrusive questions about his living situation, but she began leaving sandwiches and hot coffee near the study table, along with increasingly challenging mathematical problems that Tommy attacked with the enthusiasm of someone starved for mental engagement. She introduced him to concepts in theoretical physics and computer science that most students didn't encounter until graduate school, watching with amazement as he absorbed complex theories and began building on them with original insights. For the first time since Elena's death, Tommy began to believe that his future might hold possibilities beyond mere survival. Meanwhile, Richard Mansfield was discovering that the empire he had spent decades building was more vulnerable than he had ever imagined, constructed as it was on a foundation of leveraged debt and political connections that were proving less reliable than his confidence had assumed. The first warning sign came in the form of a federal investigation into construction permits that had been expedited through what prosecutors were calling irregularities in the bidding process. Several city officials who had been instrumental in approving Richard's most lucrative developments were facing corruption charges, and their plea bargains were threatening to expose the web of favors and payments that had greased the wheels of his business machine. The headlines in the Wall Street Journal were diplomatically worded, but carried implications that made Richard's legal team nervous and his investors skittish. The second blow came from an unexpected direction: a class action lawsuit filed by tenants in his low-income housing developments, alleging systematic neglect of basic maintenance and deliberate violations of housing codes that had resulted in dangerous living conditions. The lead attorney was a young public defender named Marcus Williams, who had grown up in similar circumstances and possessed both the legal skills and personal motivation to make the case a crusade rather than merely a job. The media attention was brutal, with photographs of moldy walls, broken heating systems, and families living in conditions that seemed designed to extract maximum profit while providing minimum habitability. Richard's public image carefully cultivated over decades, was being systematically dismantled by people he had never considered capable of fighting back. The irony was particularly bitter, because Richard had always prided himself on being too smart and too careful to be caught in the kind of obvious corruption that brought down lesser businessmen. He had paid his lawyers handsomely to ensure that every contract was technically legal, every political contribution properly documented, and every business practice defensible in court. But the investigation was revealing that the line between legal and ethical had been crossed so many times that the distinction had become meaningless, and the system that had protected him was now turning against him with the inexorable logic of political necessity. Federal prosecutors needed high-profile convictions to advance their careers, and Richard's wealth made him a target that would generate headlines and demonstrate their commitment to justice. As the legal pressures mounted, Richard found himself spending more time in his lawyer's office than his own, watching his carefully constructed world begin to unravel with a speed that seemed impossible to control. The stress was manifesting in physical symptoms he had never experienced: insomnia, chest pains, and a persistent anxiety that no amount of scotch seemed able to dull. His assistant, Margaret, had begun fielding calls from investors who were suddenly concerned about their exposure to his various projects, while his banker was requesting meetings to discuss the current situation in language that barely concealed demands for immediate loan payments. The financial empire that had taken 20 years to build was proving capable of collapsing in 20 weeks, and Richard was discovering that his network of allies disappeared with remarkable speed when association with him became a liability. The most devastating blow came from a source he had never considered a threat: Tommy Martinez himself, though Richard wouldn't learn this connection until much later. Dr. Chen had been so impressed with Tommy's mathematical abilities that she had begun reaching out to her contacts in the academic world, sharing his work with colleagues who could provide opportunities for formal education. One of those colleagues was Dr. Michael Foster, a professor of urban planning at Columbia University, who had been studying the correlation between housing quality and educational outcomes in low-income communities. When Dr. Chen mentioned that her young protégé was currently homeless and had been living in the very housing developments that were making headlines, Dr. Foster saw an opportunity to give his research a human face that could drive policy changes. The resulting academic paper, co-authored by Tommy under Dr. Foster's guidance, was a mathematical analysis of how substandard housing conditions affected children's cognitive development and academic achievement. Tommy's personal experience, combined with his exceptional analytical skills, produced insights that were both heartbreaking and scientifically rigorous, demonstrating with statistical precision how landlords like Richard Mansfield were stealing not just money from poor families, but actual intellectual potential from their children. The paper was published in a prestigious urban planning journal and caught the attention of journalists who were looking for expert commentary on the ongoing housing scandal. Tommy's story, a homeless genius whose mathematical gifts were being nurtured despite living in the conditions he was analyzing, became a powerful symbol of wasted potential and systemic injustice. When Tommy was interviewed for a feature article in the New York Times, he spoke with the same quiet dignity that had characterized his encounter with Richard months earlier, but now his words carried the weight of academic authority and lived experience that made them impossible to dismiss. "The man who owns these buildings," Tommy said, referring to Richard, though not naming him directly, "once told me I was worthless because I was poor. But poverty doesn't determine a person's value. It just reveals how a society treats its most vulnerable members." The quote was picked up by other media outlets and became a rallying cry for housing reform advocates, though Tommy had no idea that his words were being read by the same businessman who had dismissed him so cruelly on that October morning. Richard read the article in his lawyer's waiting room, the irony hitting him like a physical blow when he recognized the boy in the photograph accompanying the story. This was the same child he had threatened to have arrested for vagrancy, the same filthy rat whose quiet dignity had haunted his dreams for months. The article described Tommy's exceptional intelligence, his acceptance to MIT on a full scholarship, arranged through Dr. Chen's connections, and his plans to study urban planning with a focus on housing justice. The contrast between Richard's current legal troubles and Tommy's rising trajectory created a narrative that seemed almost biblically symbolic. the powerful falling while the powerless rose through merit and determination that money couldn't buy. The final irony was that Tommy's academic success was being funded in part by a foundation that had been established with profits from Richard's own real estate empire, a detail that would have been amusing if the circumstances had been different. Dr. Chen had connected Tommy with scholarship opportunities funded by wealthy philanthropists who were eager to support exceptional students from disadvantaged backgrounds, not knowing that some of those disadvantages had been directly created by the businessmen, whose empire was now crumbling under the weight of its own contradictions. Fate was weaving connections that neither Richard nor Tommy could see clearly, but which would soon bring them face to face in circumstances that neither could have predicted. As Tommy prepared for his final semester of high school through an accelerated program designed for gifted students, he carried with him not just his grandmother's words about the inherent worth of every person, but also a growing understanding of how mathematical precision could be applied to questions of social justice and human dignity. His encounter with Richard Mansfield had planted seeds of purpose that were now growing into a mission that would define his entire career, proving that intelligence and compassion could triumph over wealth and indifference, and that the systems that oppressed people could be changed by those brave enough to challenge them with both heart and mind. The courthouse steps were slick with October rain, the same kind of penetrating chill that had marked Richard's first encounter with Tommy exactly 4 years earlier. Now Richard descended those steps as a convicted felon, his assets frozen, his empire dissolved, and his future reduced to the prospect of 18 months in federal prison for tax evasion and housing code violations. The media circus that had followed his trial was finally dying down, but photographers still lingered, hoping to capture one final image of the fallen titan who had once commanded respect and fear in equal measure. His expensive suit, wrinkled from 3 days of wearing the same clothes, hung on his frame like a costume from a play that had closed without notice. The irony wasn't lost on him that he was now facing the same kind of uncertainty and vulnerability that he had once dismissed as weakness in others. Margaret, his former assistant, had been one of the first to distance herself when the indictments came down, taking a position with a competitor and pointedly avoiding eye contact during the few times their paths had crossed in professional settings. His penthouse apartment had been seized by federal marshals, along with his cars, his art collection and most of his liquid assets, leaving him with just enough money to rent a studio apartment in Queens, the same borough where he had grown up and sworn never to return. The neighbors in his new building looked at him with suspicion and recognition, having seen his face on the evening news for months as prosecutors painted him as the embodiment of predatory capitalism. The distance he had traveled from poverty to wealth and back again felt surreal, like watching someone else's life collapse in slow motion. Walking through the financial district where he had once been treated like royalty, Richard experienced the particular kind of invisibility that society reserves for those who have fallen from grace without redemption. Former colleagues crossed the street to avoid acknowledging him. Restaurants where he had been a regular customer suddenly had no available tables, and the doormen at buildings he had once owned no longer met his eyes with recognition. The city that had embraced him as a symbol of success now rejected him as a cautionary tale, and Richard was learning firsthand how quickly wealth's protection disappeared when the money was gone. The streets that had once seemed like his personal kingdom now felt hostile and unwelcoming, populated by people who either didn't recognize him or wished they didn't. It was during one of these humbling walks, while Richard was trying to navigate the subway system for the first time in decades, that fate orchestrated their reunion in the most unexpected of settings. The Columbia University campus was hosting a public lecture series on urban planning and social justice, and Richard had attended partly from curiosity and partly because it was free entertainment in a life suddenly constrained by financial limitations. The speaker was introduced as Thomas Martinez, a prodigious graduate student whose research on housing inequality had influenced recent policy discussions at the federal level. Richard's blood turned cold as he recognized the young man taking the podium, older now, taller and more confident, but unmistakably the same homeless boy he had dismissed with such contempt 4 years earlier. Tommy, now 21, and radiating the quiet authority that comes from hard-won knowledge and moral clarity, began his presentation with a slide showing statistics about housing conditions in low-income developments throughout Manhattan. His voice carried the same gentle strength that Richard remembered, but now it was amplified by education and purpose, reaching an audience of students, professors, and policymakers who hung on every word. 4 years ago, Tommy said, clicking to the next slide, I was living in the conditions we're discussing tonight. I've experienced firsthand how substandard housing affects not just physical health, but educational outcomes, emotional development, and a child's sense of their own worth in society. The irony of the moment was lost on everyone except Richard, who sat frozen in the back row as memories of that October morning came flooding back with devastating clarity. As Tommy continued his presentation, detailing the mathematical relationships between housing quality and academic achievement, Richard felt something crumble inside his chest that had nothing to do with his recent legal troubles. This young man, whom he had treated as less than human, was now addressing an audience of hundreds with insights that would influence policy and improve countless lives. The research Tommy presented was rigorous and compelling, but what struck Richard most forcefully was the complete absence of bitterness or self-pity in his analysis. He spoke about systemic injustice with the passion of someone who had lived it, but without the anger that Richard felt would have been entirely justified. Instead, Tommy's presentation was infused with hope and practical solutions, as if he genuinely believed that knowledge and compassion could triumph over indifference and greed. During the question and answer session that followed, Tommy fielded inquiries from professors and students with a grace and intelligence that made Richard's earlier assessment of the boy seem not just cruel, but laughably ignorant. When a student asked about the psychological effects of housing instability on children, Tommy's response was both scientifically informed and deeply personal, drawing on research while acknowledging his own experience with the kind of dignity that Richard had never learned to appreciate. The most damaging aspect isn't the physical discomfort, Tommy explained, but the message society sends when it treats some children as less deserving of safety and stability than others. That's what we have to change, not just the buildings, but the belief systems that allow such conditions to persist. Richard wanted to leave, to escape before anyone recognized him, or before Tommy spotted him in the audience, but something kept him rooted to his seat, as if witnessing his own moral judgment being delivered by someone he had wronged. The presentation concluded with Tommy outlining his vision for housing policy reform, backed by mathematical models that demonstrated how investing in quality, affordable housing would actually save money while improving outcomes across multiple social indicators. The audience responded with enthusiastic applause, and Richard watched as students and professors surrounded Tommy afterward, eager to continue the conversation with someone who had transformed personal trauma into academic excellence and social purpose. The contrast between Tommy's rising trajectory and his own spectacular fall felt like cosmic justice delivered with precision and timing that no human court could have arranged. As the crowd began to disperse, Richard knew he should leave quickly and quietly, but instead found himself walking slowly toward the front of the lecture hall, drawn by a compulsion he couldn't name or resist. Tommy was still surrounded by admirers, but when their eyes met across the thinning crowd, recognition was immediate and mutual. For a moment, the 4 years collapsed into nothing, and they were once again the wealthy businessman and the homeless boy facing each other on a Manhattan street corner. But now the power dynamic had shifted so completely that Richard felt like the vulnerable one, exposed and judged by someone whose moral authority he could no longer question or dismiss. Tommy's expression showed neither triumph nor vindication, but something more unsettling, a kind of sad understanding that encompassed both their journeys. The conversation that followed took place in a quiet corner of the campus coffee shop, with Richard struggling to find words adequate to the magnitude of his recognition and regret. "I remember you," he began awkwardly, his voice lacking any of the authority it had once carried. I said things that were inexcusable. I treated you." He trailed off, realizing that no apology could bridge the gap between the cruelty he had shown and the grace with which Tommy had transformed his circumstances. Tommy listened without interruption, his dark eyes holding the same patient wisdom Richard remembered, but now tempered with experiences and achievements that made his earlier dismissal seem even more absurd. "I know who you are too," Tommy said quietly. "I read about your legal troubles. I'm sorry that happened to you." The simple statement of compassion, offered without irony or judgment to the man who had once threatened to have him arrested, broke something fundamental in Richard's carefully constructed defenses. For the first time since his grandmother's funeral 30 years earlier, Richard felt tears threatening to fall, not from self-pity, but from the recognition of how far he had strayed from any recognizable form of human decency. "You have nothing to apologize for," he managed to say. "I was the one who was wrong. About everything, about you, about what matters, about what makes a person valuable." Tommy's response was characteristically generous. "We were both different people then. Circumstances have a way of teaching us things we couldn't learn any other way." The grace in that statement, acknowledging Richard's humanity while refusing to minimize his cruelty, demonstrated a kind of emotional intelligence that Richard had never developed despite all his worldly success. They talked for over an hour, with Tommy describing his journey from the streets to MIT to his current doctoral program, while Richard shared the painful process of losing everything he had thought defined him and discovering that his identity had been built on foundations far more fragile than he had ever imagined. Tommy listened with genuine interest, asking thoughtful questions about Richard's childhood and the experiences that had shaped his worldview, treating him with the same respect he might show any fellow human being struggling to understand their place in the world. The conversation was interrupted periodically by students who recognized Tommy and wanted to continue discussing his research, and Richard watched with amazement as the young man he had once dismissed as worthless commanded respect and admiration from some of the brightest minds in the academic world. As they prepared to part ways, Tommy extended an invitation that Richard could never have anticipated. "I'm working with a non-profit that helps formerly incarcerated individuals transition back into society. We need people with business experience to help with job training and financial literacy programs. I know you've made mistakes, but you still have knowledge that could help people who are facing the same kind of challenges you're dealing with now." The offer was practical rather than sentimental, focused on useful skills rather than moral redemption, but it carried implications that struck Richard as profoundly meaningful. Tommy was suggesting that even someone who had fallen as far as Richard could still contribute something valuable to the world, that failure didn't have to be final, and that the knowledge gained through both success and loss could serve purposes larger than personal gain. The rain had stopped by the time they walked outside together, and Richard felt something shift in his understanding of what the next chapter of his life might contain. For 4 years, he had been haunted by the memory of those dark eyes that had looked at him with such quiet dignity despite his cruelty, and now those same eyes were offering him something he had never expected to receive: a chance to discover whether the boy his parents had raised, the one who had given his lunch money to hungry classmates, might still exist somewhere beneath the layers of ambition and indifference that had accumulated over decades of prioritizing profit over people. The path forward wasn't clear, and Richard knew that redemption couldn't be achieved through a single conversation or gesture, but for the first time since his world had collapsed, he felt something that resembled hope rather than mere survival. 18 months later, Richard emerged from federal prison with a perspective that would have been incomprehensible to the man who had once dismissed a hungry child as worthless garbage. The minimum security facility in upstate New York had housed white-collar criminals alongside men who had committed survival crimes born of desperation, and the conversations during those long months had educated Richard in ways his Ivy League MBA never could. He had listened to stories of fathers who had stolen to feed their families, immigrants who had worked illegal jobs to support relatives back home, and young men who had made terrible choices because legitimate opportunities had never been available to them. The moral universe that Richard had once seen in simple terms of winners and losers revealed itself to be far more complex, populated by people whose circumstances had shaped their choices in ways that privilege had protected him from understanding. The non-profit organization that Tommy had mentioned was called Second Chances, and when Richard contacted them upon his release, he discovered that Tommy had specifically requested that Richard be given the opportunity to contribute if he was genuinely interested in helping others, rather than merely rehabilitating his own image. The program paired formerly incarcerated individuals with mentors who could help them navigate the complex challenges of rebuilding their lives in a society that often treated criminal records as permanent disqualifiers for employment and housing. Richard's first assignment was working with Marcus, a 43-year-old man who had served 8 years for drug trafficking and was struggling to find legitimate work despite having earned his GED and completing a vocational training program while incarcerated. The irony wasn't lost on Richard that he was now helping someone navigate the same kind of systematic exclusion that he had once participated in as a landlord who had routinely rejected rental applications from anyone with a criminal background. Marcus possessed intelligence, determination, and skills that should have made him employable, but employers consistently found reasons to pass him over once background checks revealed his conviction. Richard found himself using contacts from his former life to arrange interviews, calling in favors with business owners who owed him money or friendship, and gradually learning to advocate for people whom society had written off as permanently damaged. The work was challenging in ways that closing million-dollar deals had never been, requiring patience, empathy, and a willingness to invest time and energy in outcomes that couldn't be measured in quarterly profits. Tommy, meanwhile, had completed his doctoral dissertation and accepted a position with the Department of Housing and Urban Development, where his research was being translated into policy recommendations that would affect affordable housing standards nationwide. His grandmother's dream of seeing him graduate from college had been exceeded beyond her wildest imagination, but Tommy carried her memory and values with him into work that honored her belief in the fundamental dignity of every person. His apartment in Washington, D.C. was modest but comfortable, filled with books and photographs that reminded him of where he had come from and why his work mattered. The boy who had once slept in doorways was now helping to shape legislation that would protect other children from experiencing the same vulnerability and invisibility that had marked his early adolescence. The transformation in Richard's daily routine was striking to anyone who had known him during his years of wealth and power. Instead of beginning each day by checking stock prices and reviewing acquisition targets, he now started his mornings by meeting with program participants at a community center in Brooklyn, helping them navigate job applications, budget planning, and the psychological challenges of rebuilding self-worth after incarceration. His former colleagues would have been amazed to see him patiently explaining tax forms to men who had never filed legitimate returns, or coaching someone through interview techniques for minimum wage positions that Richard had once considered beneath notice. The work paid barely enough to cover his basic expenses, but it provided something his previous career had never offered: the satisfaction of knowing that his efforts directly improved other people's lives. The most profound change in Richard wasn't visible to outside observers, but felt seismic to anyone who engaged with him in meaningful conversation. The arrogance and dismissive attitude that had characterized his interactions for decades had been replaced by a humility that seemed genuine rather than performative, born from the recognition that his earlier success had been built partially on luck, timing, and a social system that rewarded certain types of intelligence while ignoring others. He listened more than he spoke, asked questions instead of making pronouncements, and approached each person he worked with as someone who possessed knowledge and insights that he needed to learn. The businessman who had once treated people as obstacles to profit was discovering that authentic human connection provided rewards that money had never been able to purchase. One particularly meaningful moment came when Richard was helping a young man named David prepare for a job interview at a construction company. David had been incarcerated for robbery, but had used his time in prison to learn carpentry and electrical work, skills that were in high demand, but often unavailable to people with criminal records. As they practiced interview questions, David mentioned that he had been homeless before his arrest, sleeping in the same financial district where Richard had once worked. "I remember seeing guys in suits walking past like we were invisible," David said without bitterness. "Made me angry for a long time, but my counselor helped me understand that most people just don't know how to deal with suffering they can't fix." Richard felt the weight of recognition in those words, remembering his own deliberate blindness to the humanity of people whose struggles had seemed like personal failures rather than systemic problems. The success stories that emerged from Richard's work with Second Chances were modest but meaningful, measured in people who found stable employment, families that were reunited, and individuals who rediscovered their sense of self-worth after years of societal rejection. Marcus eventually found work as a warehouse supervisor, using leadership skills he had developed in prison to manage a team of workers who appreciated his direct communication style and genuine concern for their safety and success. Another program participant named Rosa opened a small catering business that employed other formerly incarcerated women, creating a support network that provided both economic opportunity and emotional stability. These victories were incremental and individual, but they represented the kind of concrete positive change that Richard's previous philanthropy had never achieved, despite the larger dollar amounts involved. The annual Second Chances fundraising dinner was held at a hotel in Midtown Manhattan, just blocks from where Richard had once owned his corporate headquarters, and the event brought together program participants, volunteers, donors, and policymakers to celebrate achievements and plan for expanded services. Tommy was the keynote speaker, and his presentation focused on the mathematical correlation between second chance programs and reduced recidivism rates, demonstrating with statistical precision how investing in human rehabilitation produced better outcomes than punishment alone. His voice carried the same quiet authority that Richard remembered from their college reunion, but now it was backed by policy experience and research that had influenced federal legislation. Watching Tommy address an audience of powerful people who hung on his every word, Richard felt a complex mixture of pride, gratitude, and amazement at the journey that had brought them from that hostile street corner encounter to this moment of shared purpose. During the dinner reception, Richard found himself in conversation with donors and volunteers who had no idea about his connection to Tommy or his own dramatic fall from grace. They knew him simply as Richard, a dedicated volunteer who brought unique business experience to the program's job training component, and their respect was based on his current contributions rather than his former wealth or recent notoriety. The anonymity was liberating in ways he couldn't have anticipated, allowing him to interact with people as equals rather than as someone to be impressed or avoided. When a federal judge mentioned that she had been following the housing policy reforms influenced by Tommy's research, Richard felt a vicarious pride that had nothing to do with personal advancement and everything to do with witnessing someone he cared about making a meaningful difference in the world. The conversation that brought the evening full circle occurred as Richard was preparing to leave, when Tommy approached him near the hotel exit with the same gentle demeanor that had characterized all their interactions since their reunion. "I wanted to thank you for the work you're doing with the program," Tommy said, his words carrying genuine appreciation rather than obligation. "Marcus told me about the job you helped him find, and Rosa mentions you every time I see her. You're making a real difference in people's lives." The simplicity of the statement, delivered without fanfare or expectation of response, carried more weight than any business award or financial milestone Richard had ever achieved. It represented recognition from someone whose opinion mattered, not because of their power or position, but because of their character and lived experience. As they walked together toward the subway station, their footsteps echoing off the same concrete sidewalks where they had first encountered each other under such different circumstances, Richard felt compelled to acknowledge the transformation that Tommy's grace had made possible. "You know that day 4 years ago when I was so cruel to you? I think about it often. Not just because I'm ashamed of how I acted, but because you responded with something I didn't recognize at the time. You helped me even after I had been terrible to you, and you never asked for anything in return. I didn't understand then that what you showed me was strength, not weakness." Tommy listened without interruption, the way he had learned to do with anyone sharing something difficult or important. "I think we both learned things we needed to know," he replied. "Sometimes the most painful experiences teach us the most valuable lessons about who we want to be." The final image that would stay with Richard for the rest of his life was of Tommy disappearing into the subway entrance, briefcase in hand, heading home to prepare for another day of work that would improve housing conditions for families struggling with the same challenges they had both faced, albeit in different ways and at different times. The wealthy businessman, who had once dismissed a hungry child as worthless, had been transformed into someone who understood that a person's value couldn't be measured in dollars, and that the most meaningful success came from lifting others up rather than climbing over them. The reversal of their fortunes had been complete, but more importantly, it had revealed truths about human dignity, second chances, and the possibility of redemption that neither money nor poverty could create or destroy. If this story touched something in your heart, share it with someone who needs to remember that our circumstances don't define our worth, and that it's never too late to choose compassion over indifference. Sometimes, The most powerful transformations happen when we're brave enough to see the humanity in people we've dismissed, and wise enough to accept grace from those we've wronged. In the end, the measure of our lives isn't what we accumulate, but what we contribute to the healing of a world that needs more bridges and fewer walls between the struggles we all face in our journey toward becoming the people we're meant to be.